Welcome back to Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I will be Patrick Smith. Our guest today has been a freedom advocate for 13 years, beginning his journey after he quit working for a bank in 2009 and founded an online forum called 𝗺𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀, and that's a Texan trying to pronounce it, so hopefully I didn't butcher that. It means land of the free. It's focused on learning about the relationship between man and the state, with a particular focus on the nature of law, the money system, and cultivating individual sovereignty. He established the Brehon Academy. Brehon? Oh man, I'm just gonna destroy all this. Trying to teach early Irish culture, mythology, and law with a focus on the pre-colonial legal system of Ireland known as the Brehon Law. I'm gonna ask him. First question will be, our guest today is Kevin Flanagan. Sir, welcome to the show.
Hello, Patrick. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I know it's been in the works now for a few weeks, so
yeah, and it's totally on my end for the delay. I apologize for that. I'm glad. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because it's this topic that constantly comes up. But before we get to that, I am obligated to make the first question I ask to a new guest on the show. Sir, how did you become an anarchist?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, I work with Students for Liberty, and I work with students all over the world, really, who are liberty advocates. And I find that there's generally two ways that people come to liberty. One of the ways is that people educate themselves into the topics because they come across certain thinkers or certain writers. And the other way are people who, I would put myself in this category, are people who say, I just feel like I was always like this. And perhaps when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have the words or the philosophy to kind of back up my worldview. But I always kind of had a kind of issue with authority and always questioning. So for me, it's hard to put a direct, exact time on when that began. But I think I made the decision to commit my life to these values in and around 2009. I had been to India in 2008, had my walkabout, coming of age, sort of rite of passage experience then. And I was very interested in the ideas of enlightenment and self-realization and so on. And for me, these ideas are completely married to my conception of liberty, of anarchy, and of sovereignty.
I look forward to talking with you about all this then, but first there's sort of an elephant in the room. This was not planned. This was not part of the reason why we invited you on, but I was talking with my producer when we were setting this up a few days ago, and we were both like, wait. Where's this guy located? Because we were working out the time zones for when we were going to do this interview, right? And it's like, oh shit, it's the Ukraine. And so we're like, oh my God, is he safe? What's going on? So you have been living in Ukraine until very recently, right? Can we just kind of briefly talk about what's going on from your perspective? What's happening?
Yeah, and I'm going to just say at the offset that I'm not an expert on the geopolitical intricacies of what's going on there. And I think anybody who claims to be is lying because it's such a complicated issue that it's really hard to put into simple terms. But I can tell you from my own experience living in Ukraine, I've been living there for about 5 years on and off. I'm married to a Ukrainian. So the plan was to settle there, to buy the bit of land we had it picked out, to build a house, start a family, all of that stuff. And, this situation that's now all over the news, and it should be because it's very serious what's happening, really began many years ago. I mean, as recent as 2014, the Crimea, depending on your perspective, people would say has been occupied. They had a referendum. People questioned the legitimacy of that referendum. And there has been fighting in the east of Ukraine since then, in the Donbass and the Donetsk regions. And for me, living there as a kind of a Westerner, to be honest, like it was easy to kind of be in a bubble and not see what was going on there because I don't watch the news and it's in a different language, even if I did. But you get a sense of it then when you speak to locals. Like, for example, you take an Uber somewhere and it turns out that the person driving the Uber is a refugee who fled their home in 2014 to get away from the fighting there. So we've been kind of watching this unfold, watching the troops gathering on the border. Everybody was kind of not really sure which way it would go. When you spoke to Ukrainians in the weeks running up to, I'm thinking of last Thursday as the day when it really kind of started. When you speak to Ukrainians in the weeks running up to that and you ask them how do they feel about it, the view towards Russia is kind of like they roll their eyes and like, that's Russia, we know Russia, that's very typical. But there was also a concern about the influence of the Western powers in this, like the question of why all of a sudden are people taking an interest when we've had this struggle now since 2014. So there is a complicated net of geopolitical machinations that involve NATO and the Western powers and Russia. So that's one.
It really does feel. It really does feel, at least from where I live, that right as the COVID thing was tapering off, they went straight on to this next crisis. From my perspective, I don't know what that feels like on the other side of the world, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, there is a big conversation that could be had around the geopolitics and the history and so on. My concern right now is the fact that ordinary people are suffering in Ukraine, and there's a massive crisis on the border. We have friends who are still there who have been living in their basement for 10 days. They've now run out of water and electricity, and they're trying to get to safer places. We have family still there. My in-laws are there. My wife's entire family are still behind, and they're daily hearing explosions. They're seeing gunfire. Her uncle, my wife's uncle, is a paramedic. He drives the ambulance. And what he told us, and then it was actually said by the UN Security Council, kind of confirmed, that they were targeting ambulances and other service vehicles, and his work colleague was shot in the ambulance in front of him. So this is really happening. Whatever about how we can try and understand this situation, but I do see where you're coming from as well, and I sort of look at the world in this way also, that there are certain kind of there are certain forces at play in the world that have certain agendas, and whether we want to say that things that are happening are entirely by design, or that these forces see great opportunity to furthering those agendas when situations like this come up, like COVID-19, like war in Ukraine, there's always other factors at play that don't come into the mainstream narrative. And that's something that I'm very interested in as well.
It's certainly more plausible, right, that there's people out there that have an agenda, they want to accomplish something or change the world in a certain way, and all they're doing is sort of waiting for the right crisis or waiting for the right opportunity to kick off their plans. So it's less likely that it's like pre-planned catastrophes, and more likely that it's just people are really ready to go when the catastrophes happen, right? So
I can't remember who said it, but never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Saul Alinsky, I believe.
That's right.
The commie. Anyway, so how did you get out? Because I'm hearing over here, and part of what the world is waking up to is that you can't trust anything from either side when you get the news, especially over here, where I'm being told that people are not being allowed out of Ukraine. So my question is, number one, is that true? Number two, how did you get out?
Well, just to pick up on one point that you're making there, we're in this very unusual time in the history of mankind where most people, I don't think anybody really can trust the news sources, which is very interesting. Like there is no what we consider to be a credible source of information. But on the point of people leaving the country, so we left last Thursday, and it was really on a wing and a prayer, and just in the nick of time that we managed to get out. We took a bus journey. It was supposed to be maybe 8 hours from Kiev to Warsaw. And that bus journey was like, we were traveling for, well over 20 hours because the delay on the border was so significant. So in terms of people being allowed to leave the country, I know it's a lot harder now because there's just so many people trying to do it. But it is true that men aged 18 to 60 were being prevented from crossing the border. And I've seen that with my own eyes on two occasions. Once was on the bus itself. You have this, like, the bus is pulled over at the side of the road, and an army guy gets on and he has his gun and he checks the identification of everybody on the bus, but just the men, which is interesting. my wife was sitting there saying, like, what? Like, women can't be dangerous too? Like, why are they only checking the men's identification? And
it's all that male privilege, you know.
Exactly, yeah. There was a guy who was there, and he was like an older man. He was probably like in his 40s or something like that, older than me, I mean. And he was traveling with his son, and I don't speak the language, but I can understand a little bit, and you don't really need to understand a lot to realize what's happening. And this man was basically pleading with the soldier, saying, you know, I don't want to die here. I have a medical issue. I have diabetes, and I don't want to get off the bus. And the soldier's just saying, I'm sorry, you have to get off. And so he gets up, he grabs his things, and there's this boy who, he must have been younger than 18, but he was a teenager, let's say like 16, 17, something like that. And he's just left there sobbing for his father, you know. And the Ukrainians
they left the kid on the bus by himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ukrainians are quite kind, but when they know you, and I think there's a kind of you can definitely see kind of leftovers from the Soviet times in the kind of cultural attitudes, because most people were just like looking ahead and just kind of ignoring that this young guy was sitting there. And I sat down beside him for a few minutes and just tried to, you know, give some connection, try to have some comfort him in some way that I could, just by sitting beside him. And then we got to the border, and it was like really, really long. That was one of the hardest parts of the journey. It wasn't just this guy getting taken off the bus, but it was also people came onto the bus at the border, and they're wearing their pajamas, and they have just whatever they can carry. And they're saying, our house has just been blown up. It's on fire. We had to leave our house in the middle of the night. You see women with their children, because most of the men couldn't leave. So it's mostly women with their children walking towards the border with just whatever they could carry in their hands. And we go to the checkpoint then, and there was two guys in front of me who were probably in their early 20s, and they got to the checkpoint. And in Ukraine, it's always soldiers who are on the border. Even before the war, it would be soldiers that check your passport in the airport. And again, I don't speak the language, but I could really understand what was going on here. These soldiers were really kind of pissed with these guys who are trying to leave. My wife told me that they said, there's people are dying in this country, and you're trying to leave the country. You're not allowed to leave. So the two guys had to stay behind, and they had to get their bags off the bus because, okay, they mightn't have a gun put in their hand and told to go and fight on the front line, but they might. But they have to stay back and help with the war effort. And it was in this moment when I noticed that I'm in the queue, and there's probably about 5 or 6 guys, and I'm one of them. And you're just seeing these kids, little kids, maybe 7, 6, 5, whatever, and you can see on their face that they don't really understand what's going on, but there's a fear there, and you realize their dads are not here. So that's families who have probably just hours before said goodbye to their father, and they don't know when they're going to see each other again, you know. And that's the reality of what's happening. Putting the geopolitics aside, it's always those people, it's always the ordinary people who suffer in these wars that are usually waged by, you know, rich oligarch political class people who never will get their hands dirty and never risk being injured in these wars. It's always been that case in history. So that's what I saw.
So I'm sure, as you know, I'm sure this is the case for you because it's pretty ubiquitous, right? When you start talking about liberty and freedom absent a state controlling power, one of the first things people bring up is, well, without the government, warlords would take over and you would be in chaos. And I think when we see moments like this, I tweeted this recently, and it actually came from one of our viewers on the Discord server said this. He was basically like, hey, I thought, you know, if I followed all the laws of Ukraine and I was a good citizen and I believed in the government and supported the government's power, that I would be safe from warlords taking over. Well, what we're seeing right now is just on its face, the absolute untruth of that. If anything, you're already in a state of warlords having taken over. The problem is that the general public believes that these warlords have just power instead of actually knowing that they're warlords. And now in these moments, like right now, we're seeing Russia is acting like a warlord and believing in the just authority of the Ukrainian government didn't protect anybody from that.
No. Well, I think this idea of the warlords, the roving bandits, as it's called as well, as I remember how that idea is fleshed out, that it's like done on a cost-benefit analysis. And the idea is that, well, it's more preferable to have stationary warlords than roving bandits, meaning that the government, who's going to collect a bit of tax from you every year, is better than having a new bunch of bandits coming every month and taking what they can from you. So, I mean, this is fundamentally highlights the moral position of liberty, which is, that the state is by definition a monopoly of violence. It is a violent operation. It's a violent apparatus. I think what's interesting and should be mentioned on the situation with Russia, to the Russian regime, and we must separate the Russian regime from the Russian people, which is, I've seen some crazy stuff happening in the last couple of weeks of this kind of cancel culture against anything Russian, which is sad to see, because they, unlike in our Western governments, they do not get to pick their leaders, and they're stuck with it. They're stuck with their leader. But the justification that the Kremlin and Putin is given is very similar to justifications that we have heard in the past for other state aggressions, such as the invasion of Iraq, such as the occupation of Afghanistan. The idea of, we are going there to liberate the people and we are going there to bring them democracy. It's the same sort of rhetoric that's being used by Putin to say that he's liberating the Ukrainian people from a nationalistic government that's full of Nazis. Let's forget that the president is Jewish, but that's the rhetoric that's going on at the moment. And it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black. They're being, like, Russia is banned from all sports now. Like, they're not allowed to play in football games and all. But let's have an Olympics in China while the Uyghurs are in concentration camps. These are sort of things that I just cannot stomach, this kind of hypocrisy that we see, this kind of moral and value subjectivism. And it's like, if you're going to be appalled at what's happening in Ukraine, why can't we be appalled about what's happening in Syria? Why can't we be appalled about what's happening in Yemen? Is it because they're a different color in those countries? Is it because it's not a European country? And it's just this, the list goes on and on and on, but this is the world that we're living in. And this is why, not the only reason, but this is why I decided many years ago that I wanted to commit my life in some way to a meaningful cause, and that liberty and freedom, for me, individual sovereignty, is a message that is so important to the flourishing and to the future of humankind.
I think you nailed it. And the thing that really stood out for me when what we're seeing recently with hashtag canceling Russia or whatever is the rampant collectivization. People have been trained to only think in these concepts of massive groups of people, represented by this tiny minority of oligarchs at the top. And so they'll say Russia is attacking Ukraine, which is precisely false. Russia is a concept. It can't attack anybody. There's some people in Russia that have an army that are attacking Ukraine, and then there's a vast amount of individuals that have nothing to do with anything those warlords are doing. And there's real victims created when you collectivize that entire country and all those innocent people, and then punish them all for the sins of the warlords in the area. But see, I think you said it very well. What where do you see it going? Do you have any idea?
It's really hard to say, to be honest. I just want to go home back to Ukraine and, pick things up and help to, fix the place, tidy it up and rebuild. And when it happened last Thursday, I was speaking to my wife's father, and he was saying, like, this is only going to last for 3 days because the Ukrainian people have a heart where they want to fight for their country, that they're strong and proud people. So they're fighting for something. They're fighting for a cause. Whereas the Russian soldiers, a lot of them didn't even know that they were going to war, because they're catching young boys who were born in, like, what was it, 2000, like little 20-year-old young men, infantry, and they're saying things like, we thought it was war exercises, and apparently their equipment that they have is terrible, and all of this. So I don't really know where it's going. I want it to be over as soon as possible. But I think that I don't know Putin personally, but by the type of character that he appears to be on the world stage, he's very shrewd and calculating. But I think he miscalculated here. He thought that maybe it would be another Crimea situation where they just roll in with tanks and people would actually welcome them as their liberators. He didn't anticipate that there would be such a resistance, and fair play to the Ukrainians, because they're really giving the world a lesson in, true patriotism and the idea of like fighting for your home, fighting for your family, fighting for the future of your country and all of that. I don't know how Putin can back out of this and save face. And he has nukes, and they have Chernobyl, which is another thing that kind of is a bit of a threat, because even though Chernobyl has been decommissioned for a long time, there's still very serious like nuclear reactors there, and if they wanted to, if it got that bad, they could like blow that up, and then that's a problem for Europe, and the whole world is going to have a consequence of radiation from that. So I really don't know how this can be resolved. I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to settle for anything less than total independence and sovereignty over their territory. And I don't think Putin is able to negotiate around that. I don't think he has a way that he can negotiate and still save face and come off as this great, shrewd, calculating warlord that he is. So when you back an animal into the corner, it's when it's most dangerous, and that's something that I'm kind of concerned about. I just really don't know which way it's going to go.
I don't know if this is a good segue, but talking about warlords, talking about how that's one of the most common rebuttals you get to talking about a free society absent government, and then bringing you on to talk about a free society absent government, this seems like a through line that we can pick up on. So can you just maybe give us an introduction to Ireland? How did it exist absent state coercion? And what did they do when warlords tried to do things like we're seeing right now with Ukraine?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the system in Ireland prior to colonialism. So just to give an idea of the era here, we're talking from the 17th century back into the far, far distant past. In fact, the Irish used to say that their laws were as old as the hills or as old as the rocks themselves. And this was a system that was, I would say, very polycentric, meaning that it was fundamentally the people themselves that, through engaging with each other, through developing norms and customs, this is how the law emerged in society. And I talk about this a lot, and I want to be clear that this was not a utopian society, where it obviously had issues as well. There was a lot of warlords themselves, right? You had rival clans and rival dynasties and so on, and that is a part of the history. But we're talking also about an island that was called the Island of Saints and Scholars. So there was something going on there prior to the colonialism. I mean, the invasion by first the Anglo-Normans and later by the British, that merited that title. And one of the significant features of Irish history, why this is so important and why we have such good records of it, was because the Roman Empire never got to Ireland. So when the Roman Empire collapsed, the agriculture, the education system, the financial system, all of these systems that were dependent upon Rome also collapsed across Europe. However, in Ireland, they were able to continue uninterrupted and continue to flourish until Ireland was invaded itself in 1169. So we have very good records because the Irish monks, the Christians, they really like to write things down. And we have many, many manuscripts that date back as early as for the legal manuscripts, it's really like 6th and 7th centuries when we start to have records of them. But we know from the type of language used and the Irish that's used in it that they were much older than that. But that's just when we have the written record. And while I focus on early Ireland, I think you mentioned that my undergrad is in law. I've also studied the comparative systems of other cultures. For example, like tribal law in Africa, Native America, And what you see is the same system appears in slightly different forms across all of these pre-colonial cultures. And my argument, therefore, is that what we're studying here is how human beings organize themselves in the absence of a central command and in the absence of a central authority who is dictating the laws. Now, I have called talks like this that I give ancient Irish anarchy, but it's important to do a bit of disambiguation here. We today would observe it and we would find elements in it that we would say, that sounds like anarchist. This is not statist, and we would find definitely parallels. However, they didn't necessarily think of themselves as anarchists. That wasn't a value that they necessarily had, that they aspired to. What they had was a system of a code of conduct in society that worked because it was morally right. It was resonated with the reason of the mind, and it was based on natural principles and the laws of nature that were observed all around them. So the role of what we would call a judge was more an expert in understanding human nature and the relationships in society. And they were an expert on studying the customs and practices that the people were engaged in themselves. So it wasn't like the king would make his set of laws and they had to be followed, or the judge was creating laws that other people had to follow. It was more like they were there to interpret the customs of the people themselves. So when people engage in free enterprise and freely able to interact with each other, certain norms, certain practices start to become normal, and then they become customs. And when a custom has existed, as the Irish would have said, since time immemorial, then it became something that you expected to happen in society, which is like what we would call a law. And I'll stop on this last point and just take a breath. Is time immemorial isn't actually as long as you might think. It was only 90 years, around 90 years, 3 generations, because by the time the 3rd generation was born, that custom had existed since before anybody could remember, and that's kind of how the laws developed organically and polycentrically.
So tell me about these judges. Like, how did you become a judge? And if there was no monolithic written law that they would defer to or enforce, how did you get any kind of consistency out of that system? Like, how could you depend on a judge ruling justly?
Yeah. Okay. So there were 2 types of the law. There was what's called coin law and 𝗺𝗲𝗺. And 𝗺𝗲𝗺 is more like what we would consider like a natural law, so to speak, that obviously you don't cause harm, you don't cause loss, and you don't cause injury to others. And should you do that by either accident or design, you're expected to recompensate those people. So the system of law was not punitive like ours is today. It was restorative. Talking about the Brehons, and this is where the word comes from, Brehon Law. This is the
okay.
Brehon, yeah. It's okay.
I know. I'm Texan. My instinct was to say Brehon.
Yeah, well, that's forgivable too. The word comes from the Irish 𝗵𝗵𝗆, which is a word that we still use today for a judge. So, and the Irish didn't call it Brehon Law. They called it 𝗵𝗵𝗆, which meant a fenny was a free land tiller, like a free man who was a farmer. And it was the law of the free men, essentially, was another way of looking at it. But there were different bodies of law. There was the law of the free men, there was the law of the noble classes, there was ecclesiastical law, and these different bodies would apply depending on the case. So this officer of a Brehon evolved from what was originally the Druids. So at one point in the early history, you would have a Druid who fulfilled a function in society as a spiritual advisor or a priest. There were also the poets, and in Ireland, it's not just, roses are red, violets are blue poetry. the poetry was actually the genealogical history of the tribe. So when we say the poets, we're not talking about like Shakespeare here. We're talking about historians, clerks, the literati. And so you had the poets, you had the priests, and then you had the lawgivers or the law adjudicators. And that was originally in the office of one man who was the druid, or a woman, just to be clear, druidess, who they would be consulted because of their wisdom and their learning. But as history evolved, time evolved, and the society became more complex and more complicated, these three roles were divided into the three classes of the druid, the 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀, which is the poet, and the Brehon. And how you became a Brehon was, well, you had to actually learn this law to memory. While we do have manuscripts of the Brehon Law, they served really as kind of cliff notes for the learned classes to kind of refresh their memory. But they were supposed to memorize all of this, and the period of training for a standard judge would have been no less than 12 years. So in the early times, anybody could really be a judge if they were asked to adjudicate. So if you have a village and there's a wise man in the village, or an elder, and there's two families have a dispute, they might go and say, hey, elder, we're having a dispute and we want your wisdom here. And the Brehons were really just a formal class of learned men who had studied and practiced learning these customs of the people for no less than 12 years. And then they could specialize into being like ecclesiastical lawyers, the lawyers or the judges who only dealt with the 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀 or the freemen. Then a higher grade of judge would be dealing with the noble classes. And one thing that's very interesting, especially from a philosophical point of view or from a sociological point of view, is that Irish society was not equal. There was no equality. In fact, the system was very carefully graded into a hierarchy. And every single profession, from the judge to the priest to the comb maker or the person who looked after horses, had varying grades within it that were based on their level of expertise and their flair at their craft or their talent. And you had an honor price. So everybody was working in society with a sort of an honor price, which is kind of like a status. And then depending on that status would be taken into account in the law. So we always say justice is blind, but it wasn't blind in early Ireland. Justice had her blindfold well off, and she took account. And she said, if you are a priest and you break the law, you're going to be fined more than the farmer who's less educated and breaks the same law. So there wasn't this kind of flat punishment. Not punishment isn't the right word, but treatment of individuals within the social hierarchy. Even in the kings, which we can get to, there was a hierarchy of kings as well.
So the more respected or experienced or competent you were, the more severe the punishments. But I thought it was restitutional.
Mm-hmm. So I corrected myself when I said punishment. It's not the best word, but okay. You would pay a higher fine. But it worked both ways. So if I had offended somebody of a higher status, I would have to pay a compensation, a greater compensation, because it's like an offense of their honor. We called it like 𝗍𝗀𝗀, which was the price of his face, they called it. There was a varying, the honor price served as a varying factor in determining the outcome of a case. How
does that square with it being restitutional? Because it seems like if you have varying degrees of fines, let's say, that's not based on restitution.
Well, we have in our law today defamation. Okay. And defamation is like a kind of an intangible harm, but it's a damage to your reputation. And you can be compensated for that today, right? So it was kind of akin to that. Another kind of example here would be if you were a person who had to use their hands for their craft. Let's say you were a carpenter and somebody damaged your hand. You would have to pay an extra compensation because you've damaged the part of their body that they need to do their craft. So it wasn't just a flat fee for the injury to the hand. It was also taking account of the other factors that were broader than the injury itself, the impact that would have on their right to earn an income, and also their status was a part of that.
So you said there are three classes of law: ecclesiastical, freeman's law, which I love. What was the name for it again?
𝗃𝗃𝗃.
And what was the third?
That was called the it was the law of the nobles, and who were called the 𝗃𝗵𝗵. And there's a name for that kind of body of law that only dealt with like the noble and learned classes, let's say.
So so they just had like special laws between the nobles that were different from the, I guess, normal person's law. And how are they different?
It wasn't so much that they were different. It's just that there'd be different factors taken into account because there are different classes of society. So it was more, they just went into a lot of detail about all of these varying grades and how they interplay with each other. For example, in the law of the nobles, this is an interesting one because the question of like, well, who takes care of the poor? Who will build the roads? Okay, this is a good question. So in Ireland, it's interesting. The word for a noble was also called a 𝗲𝗏, which means a noble person, a 𝗲𝗏. And the word for generosity is 𝗲𝗏𝗃, right? So the word generosity and nobility were interconnected in Ireland. So you weren't only defined by how much property you had, which actually was a very key determining factor in your status, whether you were a free man who didn't have land compared to a free man who did have land. Well, the free man who had land was by observable like definition, by the true circumstances, was of a higher status. So it's the same as the case of the nobles, but you weren't judged by how much money you had. Your nobility was based on how much you could afford to give. And you had a social responsibility to tend to the roads, to always be able to give hospitality. So if somebody called to your door and they were hungry, they had to be fed. And if they weren't hungry, then it was like by virtue of the fact that you could not, as say a noble person, whether you were being stingy or whether you didn't have the money, well, then you lost your status because it was based on real tangible economic factors that could be observed and measured throughout society.
There is so many interesting like paths I want to take with this. This is freaking fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. Okay.
Well, I love talking about it, and so I'm happy to go any direction you want with this.
How about we're going to go all the directions? We're going to go all the directions. All right. So that was the difference. So nobility was based on status, which was based on property plus sort of social generosity. Am I repeating that back to you, right?
Yeah. Okay. Let me give you the three elements of status were blood, wealth, and reputation. So let's start with the wealth. That was like how much visible wealth you had, and that was usually in the form of cattle. Your blood is who you related to. Okay. And the third one was your status, like your flair at your craft or your character in society, how people perceive you in society, which was like the third factor. For the wealth, so you could be born as a free man with no land and no cattle. Okay. Your father was a poor free man. That was called, and in order to generate wealth, you might have to borrow from a more wealthy farmer. Okay, another wealthy free man. And the fact that you had to borrow meant that you were what's called a 𝗺𝗺𝗀𝘀, a bonded free man. But if you didn't have to borrow anything in order to generate your wealth, by definition, you were a 𝗺𝗺𝗀𝘀, which 𝗺, like tíre 𝗺, it means free. So you had free and bonded 𝗀𝗀s, which were a type of free farmer. But then if you had accumulated so much wealth, let's say you're a very good, resourceful individual. Because I have a podcast or a YouTube episode about the socialism versus capitalism. What were they? Well, it was actually both. And that's one of the things I love about this system, is that it gives us a real workable third way that puts this dichotomy aside, because there was aspects of the social welfare, and then there was aspects of, okay, you got everybody who was a member of the family was entitled to some free land. Okay, that was your social welfare. But if you were resourceful and you were like innovative, and you could turn that land into greater wealth over a period of 3 generations. If that wealth was sustained, then the 3rd generation would enter the next grade of society, okay, which was called a 𝗵𝗺. And a 𝗵𝗺 basically means a cow chief. Like they had so much cattle. Bo is the Irish for a cow. They had so much cattle that they were a noble. And they would be defined as noble because they would be lending their cattle to other smaller farmers who then owed them a rent or, you know, a fealty or some payment of like the cheese and the milk and so on that's produced. So you were actually kind of like, I guess, sort of like a venture capitalist then. You're investing in other people's enterprises. And so by virtue of that fact, you were, by definition, a higher class. So you wouldn't enter the higher class just in one generation. Your son and his son would have to sustain that status over that time. And then but they don't have to ask permission. They're not given a little badge or something from the king to say, now you're this. It was by virtue of the fact of the actual characteristics that they had in their life. Okay, so this is just on the farmers.
Okay, all right. So many trails I want to go down. Okay, so let me stay on the classes of law, because I think that's a great way of beginning to divvy this up, right? So you have the noble law, then you have the freeman law. What is which I kind of understand. That would probably be what most people would understand is just like the common law, like normal tradesman type.
That was
law
the 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀. Yeah, exactly. The 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗀.
What is ecclesiastical? Is that religious related?
Okay. Yeah. So when you're studying Irish history, you cannot divorce it from ecclesiastics, from the church, because it was with the St. Patrick came in 432 AD, and it was after that period that we started to enter the Christian age, and that's when a lot of stuff was written down. Previous to that, it was an oral tradition. So even the laws and the manuscripts that we have available to us, we have to factor in that there would have been a Christian influence at that point, and they may not be as pagan as they were prior to that. So the ecclesiastical law, we had the canon, I can't remember, it's a Latin phrase, it's like the canon 𝗁𝗵𝗺, which is like the Irish manuscript of the canon law, which was like Vatican and later the Vatican and so on. And that was considered one of the most comprehensive texts on canon law that existed for a long time, and from that era. So there was just a different way that different classes in society were treated. And if you were a judge, I'm trying to remember these words because some of them are in Latin and some of them are Irish. There was a name called the Brehon Law, which was the judge of the 3 laws. That was the highest status of judge you could be. But you might not ever need to study ecclesiastical law because you're not moving in those circles of society. You're not rubbing shoulders with the nobility and you're not in the king's court. You're like literally just among the people and you're working in your town or your village to settle disputes. You don't necessarily have to have that knowledge of the canon and the ecclesiastical law. But there were differences in how a bishop was treated versus a farmer. One of the interesting things I would say is how you determined your area of land, okay, around your home was dependent on your status, was how far you could throw a spear. So if you were of a lower grade class, how far you could throw that spear to the edge and draw a circle around, that was your territory. And while you were in that territory, you were the king of that piece of land, right? So this is where the sovereignty aspect comes into it. And if you were of a higher grade, you got two throws of the spear. Okay, so it's a bigger domain. But with the church territory was based on
how far you can throw a Bible.
That would be great. That would be great. I don't think you'd get it as far as the spear, but no. It was actually the sound of the bell, the ringing of the bell. Oh. And here's an interesting one. See, my mind is open now, and I'm just going to start downloading stuff.
Yeah, do it.
Clock. The English word clock comes originally from the Irish word clog, which is the Irish for a bell. So the bell was for ringing, telling the time, right? The church was ringing out the bell every hour, which was the clog. And if you could hear that bell, then you were in the precinct of that particular church, and that was its kind of domain, that area.
Wow. Okay. Okay. All right. So we have 3 classes of law, and the whole time we're talking about all this stuff, in the back of my mind, I've had one question, and I've been holding this question just to see what all it would apply to. It sounds like it applies to quite a bit. You have the 3 classes of law, with all the different rules: blood, wealth, reputation, the sounds of bells, as far as you can throw a spear. What else was there? I'm taking notes because I'm having a blast. Okay, so then you have like the social responsibility on nobles, to help people that are hungry and things like that. So the question that is underlying all that I'm curious about is, says who? So when you say that there's 3 classes of law, says who? When these laws contain rules for spear throwing, says who? So like, I guess my question is, where is the fundamental source of this authority during that time period? Or was it literally just everyone agreeing that that's just how it was?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit of that. Like, it was very, as I interpret it in my, privileged position 2,000 or 3,000 years later, interpreting this with my mindset, it seems that there was a lot of this was based on consensus, and what I mentioned at the start, that it was cognizant with reason. So take the idea of the spear. Well, that makes sense, because if you could throw your spear that far, then you could kill somebody from that distance, and then you're like now in the danger zone of me protecting my property, because I'll get you with my spear. But much of I would say we haven't even mentioned the mythology here, because we have an ancient mythology that much predates Christianity. And what the Brehons would do is they would look for examples in the mythology as a sort of a precedent for backing up their judgment. But they would also look for principles in nature that were observable by the common man, that this was a principle in nature, and therefore we're going to apply it to the facts of this case. And I can give you a quick story to explain that.
Please.
The first ever copyright case was in Ireland. We're talking in the Christian era, early Christian era. I can't remember exact century. We're probably talking around 6th or 7th. It was a time of Saint Columba, a very famous saint who set up his monastery on Iona, and this Iona Island in Scotland. And that church was so significant that it almost competed against the Vatican to be the center of the Christian world. Okay, and the Vatican won, and the rest is history.
I know the story because I did a deep dive on copyright, but please continue telling it. You might have more details than I did. This is good.
So there was two monks. One of them was Saint Finian, who was like a daddy monk. He was the father of many other monks. He educated them. And then there was Saint Columba. And because books were so revered back then, books were held with almost an awe, a religious reverence for the written word. Well, Columba got a hold of one of Saint Finian's books. It was called the Psalter of Jerome, and he decided he was going to copy it, because why not, And Saint Finian found out about this, and he was like really angry that he had taken his book without permission. So they went and they got judgment from a Brehon. Now, at this time, the Brehon was a king, because the king had to possess good judgment in the same way that we would talk about the judgment of King Solomon. Okay. Mm-hmm. The Irish kings were expected to have the judgment of a Brehon. And so it went to law, as they would say, and the judgment was to each cow its calf, to every book its little book, which is another way of saying every calf belongs to its mother, mm-hmm. and a copy of a book belongs to the original. So in order to give the basis for the copyright law, which was, compensation should be paid to the owner or the creator of the big book, the original copy, they looked for the principle in nature that says it's obvious that this little cow belongs to the big cow that gave birth to it. So therefore that principle should apply to the manuscript. Now, says who? Okay, your question says who? One of the maybe difficulties with the Brehon Law, and this is something that from a libertarian or anarchist perspective, we would still have to tackle this concept in our free society, right? In Anarchast or whatever, is that the judge had no enforcement power. Okay? They didn't have a police force, or they didn't have sheriffs who were going to go and force their judgment onto people. There's an aspect here that ties the view of the judge, and I mentioned how they were connected to the Druids, that they were seen to be almost spiritual in nature, that they were revered, and because they spoke in this strange, monotonous chant and they would do the judgment in poetry, people felt that the words that they were saying was kind of like God being present, or that justice was being enunciated at that point, and they had a reverence for it. And it was because of the mind of the people, the type of culture that existed, that would need to exist for a system like that to be predicated upon. It was really that people loved the law. But the end of the story is that, well, these two factions, 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀 and St. Finian, they ended up having a huge war. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of people that were killed, and some people think that's part of the reason why Columba then left Ireland as his own voluntary penance and restitution, because he felt guilty for all the bloodshed that had been caused. So even though the judgment was based on a principle of nature, even though we can even today say that copyright law, there's some grounds for that. I know that libertarians have a lot of conversation around intellectual property and so on, but back then that's what they believed. It wasn't enough to prevent bloodshed from happening. So there's a bit to unpack there. But the says who, really, it's not, I think that's one that's kind of difficult for us to conceptualize in our modern era, because we are not those type of people who love justice and who kind of, above all other things. I'll say this quote: there was a man who was called a Sir, but I don't like to say that, but it was Sir John Davies. And he was a man who was part of the British Crown, and he was actually instrumental in the final abolishment of Brehon Law from Ireland. And that's important to say that, because he was no friend of the Irish and he was no friend of the Brehon Law. But he said, there is no nation of people under the sun that loves justice better than the Irish, nor will they rest better satisfied with the execution thereof, even if it's against themselves, so that they too can have the protection of the law when they desire it. Now, that's an oldie-timey way of saying that they loved justice so much that even if they were the defendant, and even if the case ruled against them, they loved it because they could feel the justice in their heart. And they knew that if the case was reversed and the circumstances were reversed, that justice and that law would be there to protect them also. So this is a very fundamental part of this. We're talking about consciousness here. We're talking about self-awareness, the perception of an individual within society, which are things that we probably are lacking in our current world, which is why it seems that this side of a system might not be compatible with our world as it is right now.
I had an amateur understanding of some of the stuff, and I thought it was close to the justice system that we see in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. Have you read that novel?
No, but I know who the author is. Yeah.
You need listen to the audiobook. One of the best audiobook performances I've ever heard. Fantastic story. The justice system was something along the lines of, when two people had a dispute, they would find an arbiter, and the arbiter could be anybody that was respected, and both parties would have to contribute, some kind of payment or offer something to the arbiter in exchange for taking time to hear the case. And then the arbiter could make the determination as to what was just in terms of restitution, up to and including, saying you need to pay him, whatever amount of money or something like that. And then once it was done, it was done. And it was enforced merely by the community respecting that system of justice, and the fact that both people had to consent. And it's called out and this is on Mars, right? It's a fantastic story, but sorry, it's on the moon. I don't know why I said Mars, but Man, yeah. So I thought this was reminiscent of that. Maybe that's where he got
Well,
it.
it kind of comes back to my point. Yeah, it sounds like it is, because what you just described there is very, very close to how a normal court case would have happened. But it comes back to what I said at the start, that I believe that when we look at these systems, what we're actually observing is the natural way that humans organize themselves in the absence of the illusion, right, the hallucination of central authority. But just on that point, you made me think of something else. The judges, so the two parties to the suit would put up some like money to pay the judge, okay, but he also had to put money on the line. He had his honor price, right, so he had his reputation, but he had to put a certain value equal, like a percentage of what the value of the case was. So let's say it's like the value of the case is for like 100 cows. He would have to put, I think it was like 12% or something like that, that was fixed by the law, in as his own collateral. Like that's his bond, it's his insurance. And if he gave a false judgment, and we could talk a bit about what a false judgment is now in a moment, if he gave a false judgment, he forfeited that money, that value, to those two people who split it between themselves, and then they could go off and find another judge. So if a Brehon incorrectly adjudicated on a case, not only would he lose his reputation, so he's less likely to have people come to him again because he had given a false judgment, he also lost financially. So he actually had a skin in the game, so to speak, if he gave an incorrect judgment.
How was a judge held accountable?
Yeah, so we were talking about how there was different consequences if he gave what we call a false judgment. And let's unpack that a little bit. So first of all, a really fascinating idea that I think libertarians and anarchists should really love is that in Ireland there wasn't judges were not appointed, so to speak. Yes, kings had their court Brehon, but it was more of like a open market of competing judges. So you had different Brehons who wanted the business, right? Wanted to be hired to judge, and they could make money from giving a good judgment. But they're competing against each other. So in order to stand out as a good judge, in order to be worth anything as a judge, you had to be just, and you had to have a reputation of being just. So if you were someone who gave a false judgment, you stood to damage your reputation, okay? The second one was the financial consequences. But because this tradition goes back into pagan times, and I mentioned a little bit about the reverence and the almost religious nature of the judge, it was also believed that they would be struck with supernatural afflictions if they gave an incorrect judgment. So one of them was that they would break out into boils on their faces, or their face would have a rash that would be visible by other people, and therefore you would see that the judgment was fake. But there's another story about a judge called Moran, and Moran used to wear like a torque, a collar around his neck. And it said that when he was speaking the truth, the collar would just sit normally. But when he told something that was an untruth or an unjust or a false judgment, it would tighten around his neck and choke him. Now, I've heard it said, but I've never been able to prove this, that this is where we get the origin, and I'm going to say that I can't prove it, but I'll just throw it in there, of the priest's collar, the collar of virtue that the Catholic priests wear. Now, that's just a little aside. But the Department of Justice in Ireland today has a logo, and underneath the logo is kind of like an embellishment, which is the collar of truth, the collar of Moran. So there was all these kind of factors that were at play, which again were very characteristic of the culture at the time.
Okay, so if a judge delivered a false judgment, would have to be judged objectively against a standard for it to be declared false. Can you talk about what that standard?
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll illustrate it by giving you an example of a story from the mythology. So one of our greatest mythological kings is a king called 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘀. And when Cormac was a young boy, his father was the High King of Tara, and his throne had been usurped. The father had been killed, and Cormac went into hiding, and he was raised in hiding. So you have this, let's say, unjust king who is now ruling over Tara. And one day it happened that a young farmer's wife, the farmer's wife is called 𝗵𝗍𝗀, and she had sheep, and one of her sheep escaped and managed to get into the crops belonging to the queen. And these were really expensive crops because they were used to dye clothes, okay? So they're really expensive crops. So a wrong had happened, okay? This animal had escaped, it had eaten the crops, and now restitution was presumably owed to the queen. So she calls on her husband in the capacity of a judge to hear the case. And upon hearing the case, the king said, the crops were taken, so as compensation for the crops, you, 𝗵𝗍𝗀, must give your sheep as payment to the queen. And everybody was gathered around to hear this judgment, and a small voice came out of the crowd and said, well, this is not the correct judgment. This is a false judgment. Because as the crops will grow again from the land, so will the fleece of the sheep grow again on its back, so that the true compensation for this case is the wool and the fleece of the sheep, so that not to deprive this woman of her livelihood. Now that's just a little example of the kind of logic that would be taken into account. The false judgment was that the sheep should be given as compensation. The true judgment was that the fleece of the sheep should be given to the value of the crops. And in that way, restitution is paid, but we haven't taken away this woman's livelihood.
So it's terribly subjective is what you're saying. Like, that's terrifying.
Well,
like the idea that like some dude in a crowd could just, come up with some analogy that seemed to match nature and like my life would hinge on that is terrifying.
Well, the dude in the crowd was young Cormac MacArthur, and the people standing there recognized and said, well, this is truly the judgment of a king. And that's how the legend goes. I wish there was better examples than that, but like I said, this is one of the best examples I have in the form of a story. The legal manuscripts, they're not as poetic as that. They're a lot more, like, every meticulous detail is taken into account. If X happens, then Y is the answer, and so on. So it was less subjective, but the point is that
we still have lawyers today. I know those types.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
shout out to Stefan Kinsella, by the way.
Yeah,
are you familiar with him? Anarchist.
Kinsella, no.
Oh, no. Check him out. Anarchist intellectual property lawyer. A good thinker, has great things to say. He's sort of like the spearhead of the anti-intellectual property philosophy. So very interesting. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead. No, that's fine. It depends where you want to go next.
Yeah,
sure. So I guess you were mentioning that justice wasn't blind, and you were talking about like the disparity between status as a modifier in terms of like the reputational restitution. Was there any other ways in which it wasn't blind? Or maybe another question would be, what were the problems? Like, we've talked about a lot of kind of the cool things that the way this worked without a central authority, but I'm sure there were ways in which it didn't function well. What might have been some of those?
Yeah. Well, we had the example of the copyright case that devolved into bloodshed. Yeah. Into
war.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like these, I look at the legal manuscripts not so much as describing society as it actually was, but it was more aspirational. Like, if everything was perfect and everything was ideal, this would be the order of things in society. And there was a lot of things that we would say are wrong with it, and I can give you a couple of examples. One of the main ones is that the people of a higher status, their testimony was given a higher weight. So if it was a noble person testifying in a case on behalf of somebody, they might not even have been the plaintiff or the defendant, but if they're like vouching for somebody, well, their testimony is always going to be given more weight than the other guy, right? And the other guy might need to get 2 or 3 or 4 or more of his relatives to accumulate an equal amount of status that could then balance against the testimony of the noble, let's say. So that was a part of another way that justice wasn't blind, is that it gave a higher value to the testimony of people of a higher status. And then obviously, like, to talk about the status of women, because when people do a cursory glance at Brehon Law, they always say, oh, the status of women was so great, women had these rights. And yeah, by comparison to other continental systems at the time, but by comparison to today, maybe not so much. Like, so that the wife's testimony was never really given a woman's testimony was never really given value in court, except for a couple of things, like her testimony as to the father, like in childbirth, the paternity. That was something that they said. So there was always a funny phrase, was like, sure, only the woman would know who the father is, sort of thing. So testimonies of that nature. Testimonies on deathbed was always given weight regardless of who it was. So the deathbed confession or and that's still, the case today. We tend to take deathbed confessions seriously. But in society, well, let me tease that out a bit more, because I'm kind of oversimplifying it. In normal circumstances, a woman's status was tied directly to that of the closest male. So if she was not married, it would be her father. And when she interacts in society, she's kind of operating on her father's name and her father's, like, insurance. And if she was to commit a crime, or somebody had committed a crime against her, it was the father who would be the man who would stand in the case. And obviously today we know that, like, that wouldn't work, right? However, if that woman, through her own skill, and like, there was no preclusion for women to become educated or to become a poetess, or we have records of female doctors and physicians and things like that.
What about Brehons? Brehons?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brehons, yeah. We don't have, like, I have not come across, like, direct stories that say that there was women Brehons. But there's nothing in the laws to suggest that they would have been precluded. We also have to factor in that these were written by men who were of the church, and you can see a noticeable decline in the status of women as the church increases over history. So the further back we go, the more powerful women we see, and women are given this very high status in our early Ireland. The land was always considered to be feminine, and Ireland comes from Era, which is a female goddess. So there was, if you go back far enough, the women and the feminine were held in a very high regard. And I can hear, there's probably feminists today would hear what I'm saying and their blood would be boiling, but it was done for protection, because it was a brutal society as well. There was no, like, if you were a woman by yourself and you didn't have a man to protect you, well, then you can probably imagine what could happen in those circumstances. So the men were there to protect their women. And so if it wasn't the father, then it would be the husband. However, and this is important, if she rose in her own status, on her own name, and her status was higher than that of her husband's, then she operated in society on her own status. So if she educated herself or became wealthy, they could own property. They kept the property that they brought to the marriage. A woman could divorce her husband on several grounds. They could choose their partner. Even the earliest mythological accounts we have are stories of women taking their husband to court, and the judge ruling in favor of the woman. So there's a lot in the early mythologies to suggest that women had a high status, and where they didn't, it was done from a social protection point of view. But still, we might have issues with that sort of a approach today. And connected to that is the concept of slavery. So although cattle was the main unit of currency, the measure, so like dollars and cents, one of them was called a shade, and the other one was a 𝗏. And a 𝗏 was a female slave. So the value of a female slave was like a unit of currency. If it was like, I think 14 cows, something like that, maybe it was 7, doesn't matter. It was a certain set number of cows, which was called a 𝗏, which was a female slave. It's not, when we say slavery, it's not the slavery of the modern era or the recent modern era, of complete ownership of a human being. It was more like indentured servitude. And there was slavery in that sense, was absolutely a part of Irish society, which is something that wasn't great, okay? But the opposite was, it was like this. Let's say you had become dishonorable, you'd committed crime in your own clan, and your clan disowned you, okay? Because that was a consequence of not following the law, or that you didn't pay your fine. You could be outcasted. So you become an outcast, and you leave your home territory, and you go to the next territory over. If somebody didn't take you in and say, right, you can come and work on my land, you're probably going to be killed. You're probably going to die. You're probably going to be eaten by wolves or something like that. So the slavery, I wish I had a better word for it, because it's so loaded, and there's a lot of issues with the idea of slavery, and rightly so. For I'm thinking of American history here. It conjures up minds that, like, ideas that can turn your stomach to think that humans would treat other humans like that. That's not what I'm talking about here. It was more like a kind of a social welfare again, where if you couldn't afford to look after yourself, or you couldn't afford to take care of yourself, and somebody else agreed to take care of you, you owed that person labor, you owed that person loyalty, and that was the type of kind of indentured servitude. But in the same way, you could actually earn your freedom, you could buy your freedom over a certain amount of time. You could actually become a free man of a lower class, a lower grade, and operate again as a non-indentured servant.
I like to be annoyingly precise because I guess I'm a philosophy nerd. So I really want to tease through this, because what you described in the second part didn't sound like slavery. Like if you approach a noble and request to be taken in and taken care of and fed in exchange for work, that sounds like a job. So what am I missing? What part of that changes it into indentured servitude? Like, can I not leave? Is that it? Or
well, I guess you would not be able to leave until you had like paid off what you owed, and there would be some sort of but that's just one like way of looking at the slavery back then. Like, let's remember that St. Patrick was brought to Ireland as a slave. Okay. There was slave trade going on. Irish were going over to the Western Isles of Britain, even France, and so on, and there was taking slaves back. Well, I think so. Those people were slaves. They weren't necessarily going because they needed a job, but they would have been forced to work. However, from the records, it seems that they would have been treated reasonably well, like as if they were indentured servants on their land. But I don't want to kind of look at this with rose-colored glasses. As I said, it was a brutish society. All over the world was brutish, at that in that era, and it was really Christianity that softened these people and gave them a sense of maybe a conscience, the idea of like getting to heaven or going to hell, and that there was consequences for their behaviors. That would have altered over time their view of how they treated other people, how they treated slaves, and so on.
I keep waiting for my list of notes of things I want to talk about to get shorter, but it's growing as we talk. So tell me if you're running out of time, please, and maybe we can bring you back again. But until then, I'm going to keep going. So how did laws change over time? How did these different classes of laws evolve? Like, what was the mechanism? Was it like a town meeting, or was it like case law, or? Yeah.
So that's a really good question, and it kind of ties a few different concepts we've already talked about here. So we haven't really talked about the king in all of this and the role of the kings. But one of the very important events that happened periodically was called like the 𝗵𝗵𝗵𝘀, which was a gathering. Okay. And these happened at certain times throughout the year, and they happened in certain parts of the country. And one of the things that would happen there is like all the different clans from around the country, they would wear their best clothes and they would come together, and there'd be games. There'd be like, we have our Olympic Games in Ireland, I think like 1,000 years before we see any sort of Olympic Games in Greece. This was a massive opportunity for celebration of their culture, because Ireland was not a single homogenous state. It wasn't under one flag. Yes, they had a shared language, they had a shared legal system, they had shared spiritual beliefs, but the Flanagans were the Flanagans and the O'Tooles were the O'Tooles, and they were almost like little petty kingdoms in themselves. But these Teltons, or these Enochs, were opportunities for the whole country to come together in a celebration of their shared culture and then their differences as well. And one of the things that would happen at these gatherings is that the learned classes would get together and have their own kind of enclaves. So you would have all the craftsmen getting together and they'd be swapping techniques and they'd be showing off, like, this is how we make linen in this part of the country, this is our woodwork, and so on. But so did the judges. They would get together, and the poets, and they would sort of like check through the records. Okay, they would evaluate the written record, the genealogies and the histories, or here's the laws that we currently have. And through their own discussions and comparing notes, they would get a kind of an accord or a consensus that these are the laws as they currently are. And then there was one part of the festival where those would be pronounced to the whole assembly. So while the judges operated in a form of a market opening, like I mentioned earlier, they, in later times especially, sort of formed their own guilds. And in the more like after the Anglo-Norman invasion, so in the later period, so when I say later, I'm talking around 1300s, those professions were connected to specific families, which is another issue, we could say, that the positions became kind of hereditary. And there are famous families that are known for the law. There's famous families who were the healers. There's famous families who were the clerks, who were like the genealogists and so on. And even in their names today, like the 𝗃𝗍𝗃 is the Irish for healer, and they were the healers. And there's other examples like that. So in the later period, it was more kind of family business, which, as you can probably imagine, had its own problems. But they were constantly traveling around the country, meeting each other, comparing notes, discussing cases, and through a consensus of opinion, these things became like recognizing the customs, which, and I'll finish on this point, which is exactly how the common law began. When there was the laws of England were being practiced by the common man, I think it was I want to say King Henry II or King John, it doesn't matter, one of those guys. He started to send traveling judges around the country, and they would go around and hear cases, and then they would come together to the King's Inn, the bar, and they would swap notes and compare notes, and that was the origin of precedent. So it's similar, and I guess you could say in a sense there was an aspect of precedent. I'm not sure if the Irish actually realized that that's what they were doing, that they were kind of, the judges were actually like creating the law or defining what the law should be, but more through the act of like dialogue and consensus and continuously checking them against things that had changed or the facts of the day. That's how they got to this shared law. And just on the genealogies and the histories, poets would also have to get up in front of this assembly and recite many poems or stories that were fact-based. It was like the genealogy of this specific clan, and it would go all the way back. And if they got any detail wrong, so there's one guy and he's standing up, I want to be a young poet and I want to show off my skill, and I start telling you the genealogy of your clan, and there's like 50 of my peers around me who are much more learned, who are much more educated, they've been doing it for longer, who are listening to every word I say. And if I was to get any detail wrong, well, what do you think happened to me? I was chastised, I lost my status, I was shamed. And shame is a very powerful deterrent in lawmaking.
Important question. Who built the roads?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know. But also, the Irish society wasn't really based around cities. There were, after the Viking era, more like cities started to pop up, but it was a very dispersed, and they were a forest people. I heard it said, and I haven't been able to verify this either, but foreigner, as in like the word foreign has the word reign in it, which is to rule. And so foreign is like outside the rule. That you could kind of think of the Roman law and the Brehon Law as two kind of competing systems, where the Brehon Law was the law of the forest people, and the Roman law is the civilly law, the law of the city. So we didn't have a major network of roads, but in our most ancient maps, we do have, like, there are definitely roads. I don't know who built them, but it would have been the responsibility of the noble of the town or the village to maintain those roads. Why? Because if a visitor comes to your house, don't you tidy up before they arrive? Don't you make sure it's kind of nice before they get here? And you, as the noble of that town, your reputation was tied to that. So it was kind of hitting on a few of the points that we've already sort of discussed around reputation and status and so on, that it was a part of your dignity to make sure that the roads in your area were maintained. And who maintained them? Well, they were the indentured servants. They were the people who you had like taken in and given food and shelter and so on to. They would be the ones that would work on fixing the lands or minding the fields, or the more kind of like menial labor.
Okay. What other kinds of social responsibilities did these nobles have? You said that if, somebody was hungry, they had to take care of them, or how did that work? And for how long? And what were the limits, and who decided the limits, or how did that work?
Well, it kind of worked both ways. And this is another issue that I could say with the system, was that there was this custom where the noble would travel, do a circuit around their land. And along the way, it was prescribed in the law how many of their retinue they could bring with them, like how many poets they could bring with them and how many knights and so on. So they could turn up at your house with like 12 or 15 guys, and you were obliged to give them food and entertain them for that period. And this was something that was considered a problem. In later times, this is what we call livery. Like the British soldiers also did this in Ireland, where they just kind of travel around and take whatever they want. So on the hospitality thing, though, it was essentially the obligation of the chief of the clan or the sept or the area to make sure that hospitality was provided. And there's a famous line which was like 3 things that a good king has, and one of them was a never empty pot. So there would be in his house, there would be a big pot of food, and anybody could come and eat from that. But in order to kind of formalize this and make it more, they had, what were they called? Brehons. They're called Brehons, which were like hostels, that every big community had somebody who was a hospitaller, and they had a house, and it was usually on the crossroads, so where travelers are passing by, and they would give free accommodation and free food and free entertainment to anybody who came to that place for as long as they needed it. And how they paid for that was, it was kind of, I don't want to say taxation, because I know, like, taxation, we don't like tax, but because of the nobility of, the reputation of the clan depended upon it, people would give wealth to this person. They would give some cattle, they would give like some of their cheese. The king would be responsible for making sure that that person was well stocked so that they could afford to entertain. And the idea was that if anybody came to your town, you never wanted them to leave and say that they're stingy or they didn't give me hospitality. And it applied to everyone. It applied to the king, but it also applied to the ordinary person, where if somebody knocked on your door and they wanted shelter, it was kind of a crime to deny them that. You were supposed to be able to at least give them water, some hot food, and, really importantly, entertainment. And what I love about this concept is Ireland is still called the land of 1,000 welcomes. And we love this reputation about ourselves that we are very hospitable and very open. And I like to remind people, well, that's because it was kind of illegal at some point in our history not to be given that hospitality. And it was said that at least every member of the family or every member of the clan, whatever, had to be able to perform some trick, had to be able to play an instrument, to tell a story, to sing a song, do something to entertain the guests.
Okay, so let's put how did it end? Like, what happened that ended the system?
This is it's a good question, and probably a good way to like bring this into land, because like and I'm happy to keep going. I just want to be clear, but there's a lot to it. I know there's a lot to it, and we've already covered a lot. But it didn't end voluntarily, and that's really important. It didn't end because it was replaced by a better system. In fact, there were laws issued by the British Crown, the Statutes of Kilkenny. I want to remember the year. I think it was like 1350 or something like that. That basically the Anglo-Normans came in 1169, and they had kind of their couple of bases around Dublin, and that was an area called the Pale. Dublin, Kilkenny, Wexford, Waterford, which is where the phrase "beyond the Pale" comes from. And you said that's beyond the Pale because it was outside of the Pale, which was a fence, basically. Pale comes from the Latin word palus, which is also connected to phallus, just as an aside. So there was these poles all around the outside of the territory of the Anglo-Normans, and outside of that was these wild, lawless, uncivilized Irish people. So something that was beyond the Pale was considered to be like uncivilized and so on. But these settlers, these invaders who eventually became settlers, they became more Irish than the Irish themselves. We have this saying, they became na Gaeli, na Gael Féin, more Irish than the Irish themselves, because they began to adopt Irish customs. They began to wear their hair long and let their beard grow out. They began to ride their horses without using saddles like the Irish did, nice and rugged and wild. They began to speak Irish, but one sin that could not be forgiven by the Crown is they began to go to the Brehons for justice. So this piece of law called the Statutes of Kilkenny was basically aimed at these Anglo-Norman people who've been living in Ireland for a few centuries now. And it said anybody who does these things, anybody who wears their hair long, who speaks Irish, who wears the dress of the Irish, and who goes to the Brehon for justice is adjudged a traitor to the king. And we could spend another hour talking about this very interesting interplay between the British Crown common law and the Brehon law. When people think about the conflict in Ireland, which still exists, 6 counties of Ireland are still under British rule, right? People always think nowadays it's about Protestants and Catholics. But for the first couple of 100 years, everybody was a Catholic. There was no Protestants, all right? So what was the conflict? What was it based upon? And my theory is that the conflict was, strictly speaking, a conflict of legal systems. There was 2 different conceptions of law that were clashing with each other because they didn't resonate. To the Irish, the idea that a king sitting in another country could make a law and impose taxes on people was completely alien to them. It was not law. It wasn't something that resonated in the heart. It wasn't cognizant with nature. It was unjust. So they just continued to live their lives as normal. The laws of England were not applied to the Irish. And historians have criticized that. They've said, had the laws of England been extended to these wild Irishmen, then maybe our history might not have been so bloody as it was. So we're around 1300s. We have these people becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. We're going to fast forward.
So the Irish justice system was outcompeting the king's justice system, especially if these foreigners would come in and see such a benefit in it that they start adopting it and going to the Brehons. So they could have gone to the king's courts, but they chose to go to the Brehons. Okay.
That's exactly right, yeah.
And just to be clear, like, and the state can't stand competition.
yeah, exactly. When we talk about Anglo-Normans, it's important to realize that mostly these were French who had only spent like a short time in England and later became the English, and they were more French than they were British. So that's just important to factor into like how did they perceive themselves. And names like Fitzgerald, it's not a Gaelic name, but it's an Irish name now because the Fitzgeralds became more Irish than the Irish themselves, and we celebrate people like John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who has a Norman name and an Irish name, but we consider the Fitzgeralds just as Irish as anybody else because they absorbed the culture. And being part of the nobility, they actually protected the culture for a long time because they employed the Brehons, they employed the poets, they had the harpists and the genealogists compose genealogies for them, and they kind of protected them within the order. So we're fast forwarding a bit here, we're skimming through history, and with the Tudors, what we had was a period where what was called surrender and regrant. So you imagine all of these tribal chieftains, like my family would have had a chieftain called the O'Flanagan or the Big Flanagan, the O'Neills, the O'Tooles. Every Irish family is descended from royalty, but the concept of royalty ain't like continental royalty. It was like, that's my little field over there and I'm the king of that field. There was a period in Irish history where the British campaigns, they were sending over massive armies, like much better armed and well trained, to fight against the Irish so that they would surrender their Irish chieftain position, their title of I am the chieftain of my clan, I'm the Taoiseach of my clan. And in return, they were regranted a title under the crown, which was called an earl. And there's a whole conversation here about the nature of legal personhood and title and why this was so important. Because in the Irish system, to become a chieftain, it didn't necessarily go to the eldest born male. We didn't have primogeniture. What we had was what's called tanistry, where the next chieftain was elected from all the eligible males, right? So
in the family?
Okay. Exactly, or in the clan, let's say, or the wider tribe. So succession was not determined upon firstborn birth. That means title was not descending in the same way. But the English system and legal personhood and all of that, so what that would mean is if a chieftain made an agreement with the British Crown, once that chieftain died and his cousin or his nephew or his brother took on the title of elected chieftain under the Gaelic custom, that arrangement with the crown is now void. And now the crown has to go and renegotiate terms with the new chieftain. Mm-hmm. But by getting them to have this surrender and regrant to take a British title of nobility, which passed automatically to the eldest male son, that meant that the obligations and legal, characteristics would pass automatically, and that's kind of how they eradicated slowly this the primacy of Gaelic chieftainship. There was a lot of war, there's a lot of fighting that was going on, and in 1604, the last Gaelic chieftains, when I say Gaelic, they hadn't surrendered and regranted yet. That was in Ulster, which is now part of the British Empire. That was the last place to make a stand. And the most Gaelic part of Gaelic Ireland was Ulster. And the O'Donnells and the O'Neills rallied big armies. They got help from Catholic Spain, and they went to fight this Battle of Kinsale, and they were absolutely devastated. They were destroyed at this battle. There's reasons for that. The Spanish landed in the wrong place, and all sorts of things went wrong. And then you had what was called the Flight of the Earls, when these nobles, Irish nobles, the last of these nobles, left Ireland on boats to try and get help. Some of them went to Britain, some of them went to Rome, some of them went to France, all the Catholic countries, and they never came back. And once they left, the whole order began to dissolve because the Brehons and the poets and so on, the Gaelic order was intimately tied to that idea of nobility. They were the protectors of it, and when they left, it went. And then we have a period of around 200 years of the penal laws, which were very brutal. You'd want to talk about racist segregation laws, like these were it. Catholics couldn't own land, they couldn't inherit property, they couldn't speak Irish, they weren't allowed to educate their children, which is why we speak English today and we don't speak the language of our ancestors. It's a very sad part of our history, to the point where up until, 200-300 years later, we had the War of Independence and the rebellion, 1916 rebellion. So the law was I would say beaten brutally out of the Irish, to the point that they ripped the tongue out of their mouths so that they couldn't speak their language anymore, and the law was lost from their heart. And the last thing I'll say on this is that there was writing in 1950s, an Irish barrister said that the Irish irreverence for law doesn't come from a sympathy with crime or injustice. It comes from the fact that the Irish know, even today, that the law in Ireland is not Irish law. And however just it might be, it was once most unjust. It does not command reverence as a native institution, but merely respect nowadays as an essential part of the machinery of government. And I believe that Irish people still know today in their heart that this is not our system. We are a colonized people. We're people who lost our tongue. We're people who lost our love for justice. And that's really the end of the story, and that's why I do the work that I'm doing, because I want to try and spark that connection in Irish people again. And not just Irish people, but it's our law system. Most people Irish people wouldn't be able to have a conversation about this legal system as I have. They know we have a language, they know we have Irish dancing, and we have our sports, but they don't realize just how central the love of justice was to their identity. And I think that that's a tragedy.
So what's the state of things today then? You'll have to forgive me. I'm not a geopolitical activist. I don't keep an eye on this. I'm not familiar with the history. So as it stands today, what's the situation in Ireland? I mean,
well, that's a big question. Our legal system is based on the British common law. Mm-hmm. Our parliamentary system is based on the British parliamentary system bicameral, which means of two houses, where in Britain you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Mm-hmm. We have what we call the Dáil and the Seanad. It's essentially the same concept, but I should say we use some Irish words that harken back to these old times. That assembly that I told you about, where everybody gathered together, and that was also called the Dáil, which is what we call our assembly today in Parliament. The Prime Minister of Ireland, you might know this, is called the Taoiseach. Very strange word for people who don't speak Irish, but that means literally a chieftain. And the second in command, the Deputy Prime Minister, is called the Taoiseach, which is the Tanist. I said to you how they were elected from the most eligible person in the tribe. That was called Tanistry. So we call our second in command the Taoiseach. But we have a British system, and we have a British parliamentary system and a British legal system. And the north of Ireland, these 6 counties in Northern Ireland, still remain part of the British Empire today. And there are people who would say that the War of Independence has never really ended, and it won't be truly ended until Ireland is completely free. Now, I'm old enough to remember the tail end of some of the Troubles. I remember bombs going off in Ireland in the 90s.
I am nearly completely ignorant, so I'm not going to fake like I know. Mm-hmm. I know that there was some trouble, but I don't know what it was about. Can you talk about any of that? Or
yeah, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, to be honest. But what I can say is that in the early 1900s, the time of the First World War, there was like movement for home rule. So Ireland wanted to, there's people who wanted Ireland to have home rule, not even independence at the time, just to have home rule. But there's 2 religions in Ireland now, which is like Protestantism and Catholicism. And that goes back to Henry VIII, when he converted away from, because he wasn't allowed to have a divorce and he was horny. So he created his own church, and that created like the Anglican Church. People converted to Protestant Anglicanism, and those people, it's very sad, because the people in Northern Ireland who are today Protestants, they were settlers who came under the Tudor, like they're descendants of settlers who came in the Tudor regime, but originally they're genetically the exact same people. You know, they're genetically Ulster Scots, we call them. The original name for Ireland was Scotland. We are Scots. And these are genetic cousins. They're just divided by religion. And the tragedy, I think, of Ireland is that you have two groups of people fighting for two empires, the British Empire and the Roman Empire. And in that melee, Gaelic Ireland has been forgotten about. Gaelic Ireland has not, they didn't fight for Gaelic Ireland. They just fought for these two foreign empires, I would say. Right now in Northern Ireland, there's a power sharing system where, you know, there's Sinn Féin and the DUP, the Democratic Ulster Party, something like that. And, you know, there's still tensions between the two communities. They have what's called peace walls, massive walls that kind of like what you see in, you know, Israel and Palestine. They say that there's peace, but it's not really a peace. It's more of a truce that's been there since the 90s, but there's still tensions there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's
about all I could say on it.
Why did you leave? Why aren't you living there? You just enjoy world travel, or you met your wife, or you know, like what happens?
Well, Ireland was hit very bad in the mid 2000s, like 2007, 2008, the economic collapse. And Ireland on paper looks like a wealthy country, but that's because we have Facebook and Google and Pfizer and all these massive wealthy organized companies have their head offices in Ireland. So on a GDP per capita, it looks great. But to actually live there, I mean, I was just talking to an old friend today, and he says, like, I'll never afford a mortgage in this country. It's very expensive to live. There's not a lot of opportunities at the moment. So for me, I actually moved out of Ireland to study. So I moved to Prague. I didn't have the intention of staying out of Ireland. At the time when I was leaving, I thought I'd be back in a year or two. I went to do my master's in the 𝗃 Institute, which is small private university in Prague that they're free marketers. And, you know, when we learned economics, we learned Keynesianism as a comparative subject, but we're looking at Austrian economics and we're studying philosophy of liberty. And that's why I went there. And part of my work with Students for Liberty, I get to travel a lot. So I was traveling around the world. I've been to, I think, 4 continents, maybe. I've lost count of the countries, but well over 40. And somewhere along the way, I ended up in Ukraine, and I met a woman at a conference, and we became friends, and then we became more than friends. And then, you know, life just puts a spin on your plans. And now I'm like living in Ukraine. And to be honest, like you get used to it because we're very adaptable. But there was often moments where I just kind of look out the window and I'd be like, what the fuck am I doing in Ukraine? Like I never planned it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also I lived in Georgia, in 𝗃𝗵𝗄𝗃, not Georgia in America, but Georgia in Eastern Europe, 𝗁𝗃𝗃, as they call it in their own language, which is also occupied by Russia, I should say. I've lived in Prague also. And then in the pandemic, I got stranded in Athens for 4 months. So I consider that I've lived in Athens as well. And I just love traveling, and I'm very used to it now. And one thing led to another, and I ended up living in Ukraine, and then I ended up evacuating from Ukraine, which obviously wasn't expected either. So now I'm in Poland.
Do you need anything? Like, are you in any kind of trouble or in a bad place where you need assistance or anything like that? I'm sure that we could put something together.
Not really, to be honest. And I've been kind of overwhelmed with the outflowing of support that I've gotten. To be honest, I got some really bad news last week, as well as the war. The same day that the war broke out, I confirmed that I have some brain tumor. And I'm in a position right now where I'm told by the doctors I just have to wait for 3 months and see how it goes. And I have basically 3 options. So like the things that I need at the moment are more, these challenges are putting me in a position where I'm kind of forced to slow down and think about life, think about what I want, what impact I want to make, what world do I want to leave for my children, future children. And These last couple of weeks have just been processing, what's going on, processing the fact that my life is snatched away from me in Ukraine and medical issues and things like that. And for now, I'm just kind of I've been kind of in a position now where I have to give up control a little bit and just submit to the circumstances and trust that things are happening. I'm not getting into like supernatural philosophical conversation about God and stuff like that, but I believe that things happen for reasons that we don't always understand, or at least we can find reasons in them and to give deeper meaning to our lives and to our existence. And that's where I'm at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I
really
if there's anything
you asking me that.
If there's anything I can do or we can do, I will see what we can do. I will make it happen.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Wow, it's hard to segue from that to the next thing I wanted to talk about.
I know.
That's
it's like.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that. So, when I asked you at the beginning of the interview, like, what's something that you want to make sure that I ask about or mention, which kind of goes with what you're just now saying, where you're looking to figure out how you want to affect the world. You did a thesis on, you said, the role of society based on principles of magic, symbolism, and ritual. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, I can talk about that. Thanks for bringing that one up. So I was a weird child, and I was like, you asked me about when did I become an anarchist, and I can't really put my finger on it. I was always asking questions, and I always had like weird ideas as a kid, and along the way, I've like, I told you I went to India and I was into that trip, the Eastern mysticism and the Buddhism and all of that. But it was a time where I was like interested in the principles of the occult. It's not like I wasn't casting spells or anything, but I was really interested in the mechanics of magic and symbolism. And I started to see symbolism all around me. And I felt like I was learning a language to kind of interpret reality in a different way. And the conclusion, or one way that I sum up my position here, is that magic is the foundation of science, and science is the perfection of magic. So when I talk about magic, I'm not talking about Harry Potter or waving wands or anything like that. My definition of magic is very mundane. It's so mundane that it covers almost anything that we can do. It's simply when human beings successfully apply their will to create a causal effect in the outside world. So willpower, the application of will in altering external events, to me is an act of creation, which I summarize as saying is an act of magic. Now, the answer to the questions are, from where does law get its force? From where does government get its authority? And from where does money get value? And I think the answer to all three of those questions is the same. I think it's belief. It's mere belief. Okay? It's imagination. And belief is influenced by ritual, which I define as habitual behavior done over time. Okay? It doesn't have to be a big ceremony with incense and candles. It's habitual behavior and symbols. What makes the chieftain the chieftain? What makes the president the president? What determines when a man stands on an altar and says, I do, and a woman says, I do, that something changes their characteristics, the quality of that relationship, to now we say they are husband and wife? To me, it's ritual and symbol. So my kind of, how I approach my thesis is that this is the order of reality. This is the order of human society, that we use ritual and symbolism to impute higher or transmute a meaning onto otherwise mundane things. My focus was money, even though I can talk about the law here and what's a summons, right? When you get a summons to court, right? Well, back in the medieval times, when people who were scientists were called natural philosophers, and they were the alchemists, which gave us chemistry, and they were the astronomers, which gave us the astrologers that gave us astronomy, right? This is what I mean about magic is the foundation of science, but science is the perfection of magic. because you learn the elements to actually create the cause and effect.
I thought you said that. I thought you said the definition of magic was willpower creating effects in the world. But wouldn't science be more studying the world and kind of going the other direction?
Well, if you know that if you combine these two metals, you get a certain outcome, right? So it's studying the cause and effect nature of reality, okay? And when we establish those truths, we call it science, okay? But to me, it's an act of creation when you do that combination, when you go through the transmutation process, say, of combining the two elements to create the third element. And these natural philosophers, they studied particles, they studied chemicals, they studied, but they were also very religious, and they also believed in like angels and spirits and so on. And if you look at any grimoire or book of magic from back then, there was the idea of like conjuring a spirit to come and do your bidding for you, and you call that a summons. And in order to summons a spirit, you needed to have the name of the spirit, and you needed to have a magical symbol, and you wrote it down on a piece of paper, and you did a certain ceremony, or you said certain words, which are spellings, right? Spells. And they believed that they could get these entities to do their bidding. Now, fast forward to today, you get a piece of paper through your door with a magical symbol on it that looks like the American. I
have one like right over here. I just got one. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
And it has the name of a spirit on it, and it has an order to appear as if by magic. There you are in court, the spirit that's been summoned. So
Patrick Smith, you are commanded to appear.
Exactly, and there you are. Right, and the judge wears his black robes, which there's a whole thing there. And another word for a judge is a magistrate. And what's a magi? Okay, right. So we're getting somewhere here. But the word magi,
I have always said for years, and any of my viewers can verify this and back me up on it. I've always said that these laws is nothing more than a system of magic spells. And the lawyers are spellcasters, and the judges are arch magi. And it's funny that you're saying it. Well, go ahead.
That's great. No, I'm glad you said that, because then I feel like it's less of an uphill kind of battle to make this persuasive, because we're on the same page. We're resonating on a chord here. You're
coming from bottom up. I'm trying to describe reality, because what I say when I say it's a system of magic spells is the step two of that is, and don't forget, magic's not real. And so the system of laws that they're enforcing on you, they only have power if you believe they do, and which might fold into your definition of magic and will. And interesting. All right, go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, exactly. But I love that the word magi is hidden in the word imagination. And what my premise is this: to say that all of these things are imaginary is not necessarily to say that they're not real, right? But yeah, we can tease that out. But my point is not, isn't that curious and interesting? My point is, isn't that fucking amazing how powerful these minds are when we can literally just imagine into existence the whole financial system, the whole intricacies of our whole social order is based upon magi, magi, nation to give birth, right? Like natal, postnatal, prenatal, nation. It's like, I am the magi of my creation. And it's what our attention is actually a currency. It's an energetic currency that gives value, that gives life to the thing we're paying attention to. That's why everything around our culture is about trying to grab our attention through commercials, through Facebook posts, through, celebrities and so on. It's all about the currency of attention. There's a reason why Zeus is dead. Is because we don't pay attention to him anymore. We have different gods now, and they feed on our energy of our belief. So I liken the analogy to when you're a kid and you see a magician, a stage magician, and you don't know that this is a trick. You see him pulling these things out of his sleeve, and he pulls the rabbit, and you're literally entertained, right? It's entertainment, which if you break it down, it's like enter, to go into, tain is to grab, attain, and ment is the mind. So your mind has been grabbed, okay? And you're like awestruck, and the actual physiological change in your body as you're impressed by this is the magic having its effect on you. It's the glamour of it, which if you look up the origin of the word glamour, it comes from Scotland, and it means to cast a glamour on someone. It meant to mesmerize, to entrance them. And now we have glamour magazines and glamour models, which are there to capture your attention, to provoke certain responses physiologically in your body, which is, to me, the proof of the magic is actually working. But if you take that child, or remember when you were the child, and I remember there was a TV show, Magician Secrets Revealed, and you're so intrigued to see how it works. But once you know how it works, guess what? You're never going to have that same impact. That spell is never going to work on you the same way again, because you have knowledge. It's impossible to be deceived while you know you're being deceived. So simply understanding the mechanics of how reality works through this analogy of magic, which the word magic is connected to the word machine. Actually, it's a mechanism. It's a technique, which under that technique, we have things like persuasion, we have things like advertising, we have like use of color, use of sounds, use all of these things that can be combined with knowledge. This is the science part, to create a desired outcome, desired effect. So that brings us to money. Well, money comes from, where does the word money come from? Well, it's moneta, which was a goddess, okay, in ancient Rome. And the idea was that pieces of metal would be brought to the temple, which was the mint, and they would be blessed, and they would be given certain symbols printed on them of the goddess, and that would transmute them from a mundane piece of metal into now a holy artifact, which was money. So money is the thing that makes our world go round. It's directly tied to the choices that we can make in our life. It's directly tied to our freedom. It's kind of like a god in a way. It feeds us. It gives us security. It gives us choice and freedom. But it was fundamentally
it's an extension of our will. You know,
yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
the money is the root of all evil rant in Atlas Shrugged by Francisco de Anconia kind of touched on some of that, how money will work for one that deserves it and destroy one that doesn't, and how it's an extension of a man's will. Yeah. Anyway, that was good.
Yeah. So money in itself is kind of it's a form of magic. I see it as that. And like what makes cigarette money in prison? I have cigarettes in my pocket, but it's not money, right? But if I go into a closed social group, social unit, where it becomes currency, or in my studies, I learned that there was tribes that used whales' teeth as currency, okay? Or they used 𝗼𝗵𝗶 pennies, they were called, which were little strips of iron that were blessed by a shaman, okay? What makes one thing money and the other thing not money? In fact, one of this tribe who had the whale's teeth, there's a story, I don't know if it's true, but there's a story that when they were discovered by, I don't know, British explorers or whatever, they had found a kind of a chest of gold coins that had washed up on the shore. And instead of them picking up these gold coins and going, wow, look at all this, they were using them to skim on the ocean as very good throwing stones for getting skimming on the ocean. My premise is that the thing that makes it money is that it requires this mental act of transmutation in the mind to turn it from mere metal into money, into a mere cigarette into money. The one common ingredient that all of these tokens have is that it requires the belief of the mind. And this is what I believe is the true philosopher's stone. These alchemists were trying to find the ingredient in nature so that they could take base metals and turn it into gold. Well, we've done it. We've turned paper into gold by using the alchemy of our mind to apply value that is transient and ethereal to something that doesn't actually have that value, but I can use it to go and buy gold, piece of paper. And I think that is absolutely amazing.
I try and be a pretty rational, grounded person, and so I'm curious why you're interested in sort of applying these mystical, supernatural terminology to things that are pretty basal, like, you know, anything can be money if it's valued. What makes it money? Somebody values it, and it's easily exchanged, and it's fungible, and things like that. Like, those are all sort of economic simple terms for what makes something money. What benefit do we get from talking about it in terms of money is magic and, we're transmuting things in our mind? Like, you know what I mean?
I think when you look at money historically, it backs up what I'm saying here. Like, all of our money actually comes from religious practices. It's either, if you take the example of moneta, it was originally tied to there was a religious aspect to it. Like, the first coins were talismans, and they were believed to have protection. Okay, they were used to protect against demons or whatever. In these other cultures, in order for something to become money, it would be blessed by the shaman. I think the same thing is happening with money. As why is this man now the president? Because we had a ritual called election, and he performed a certain thing in a certain way, and then the human mind almost validates the thing because this ritual and this ceremonial aspect has happened. We're not really connected to that anymore in our modern society. We just kind of take it for granted. But there was a legal philosopher called Hägerström, who's Swedish, I think, and he made a very strong case to suggest, I'm jumping to law here, that originally the reason why law had a compelling force on people, why did they feel compelled to respond to a summons, was because the idea of religion, magic, and state and society, they were very intimately connected. So the idea of the word obligation, in the past, they felt that had a magical or religious significance that compelled them to do it. But over the course of time, Hägerström says that we lost the connection with that magical aspect of it, but we still feel compelled to respond to the summons and so on. And I'm curious,
wouldn't it be more accurate to say that, like, we lost the superstition in that stuff? Like, we lost the false superstition that it had power, right? So like for example, summons? Now I'm going to respond to this summons because there's a gun pointed at me if I don't. Like, I see the truth of the situation. There's no magic involved. It's violence.
But is there really a gun pointed at you?
There really would be if I didn't respond.
Like a physical gun at your head?
If I didn't respond long enough, absolutely, yeah.
They might come and drag you to your prison cell, but it's conceptual.
Unless I resisted. If I didn't let them drag me to a cell, then there would definitely be guns. So, yeah.
This is a good point, and it's a fair point, because people have raised that with me before when I've talked about this theory. And I'm not following the summons because I think it has a magical spell, but I'm following the summons because somebody out there believes that they have the authority because of this magical piece of paper to hold a gun to my head. Mm-hmm. And what I'm suggesting is that, yes, they're doing that, but that's not legitimate. That's not founded in the laws of nature or reason. That's because they are affected by this magic as well. And they think that just because they have a uniform with a little magic symbol on their chest, that they have the legitimate right to do that, which I equate to being an effect of the magic spell, the illusion that they're under. And I know you talked to Larkin Rose. I've watched some of your conversations with him. He's somebody who I admire a lot, and he speaks about this, I think, even much more eloquently than I'm able to, when he talks about like how they are hallucinating authority to exist. And that's what he's kind of challenging, like that people have this hallucination. Well, I'm acknowledging that hallucination exists, and my premise is that the hallucination is strengthened in the minds of people because we have these social rituals and these social symbols, whether it's the stars and the stripes, whether it's the Irish harp and all of that, and being able to see them for what they truly are, which are just simply pieces of paper. We know that the person who points the gun at your head is not legitimate. We know that that is against the laws of nature, but yet they still do it. So I'm trying to understand what factors in society can we identify which suggest why they believe that way. Why do they fall for the illusion, the hallucination of authority?
Which talk with Larkin are you talking about that I had?
I watched a few of them, but I've seen there's one, I know you know him, but there was one I watched where you were both talking about The subjectivity of morality.
Objective morality, yeah. We were in a hotel room at 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗀. Yeah, that was a good job.
𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗀, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this is a fascinating topic. Maybe we can have a whole show talking about the implications of this. I'm always careful to it's easy to grant power, magical power, to words and the definitions of words. And when I say magical power, I mean bullshit, like stuff that doesn't exist, right? Like just because a word used to mean something doesn't now invert reality. Like language is used to describe reality. Language never determines reality. It's always filtered through the mind of a human that decides to believe in it, to give that definition power that then can act in the world through the human. And so I always try and keep really focused on that in discussions like this.
So just on that, like and I think that I could have spent more time teasing out what I mean by magic, but my basis for this is like, it's a functional definition or an operant definition that it works because we see that it has an effect in the actual behaviors of the people who are exposed to these symbols or these ideas. So it's not to suggest that necessarily the eagle of America, the symbol of the Great Seal, somehow actually has magical power. But if that causes an effect in the minds of the people who are interacting with that symbol, it's no different than the witch doctor putting the bird feather on the head of the ordinary guy, this ordinary, smart chimp who's just no different than me. But because this shaman put this feather on this guy's head, he is now the chieftain, and we all have to like act accordingly. So for me, it's a much more practical, psychological definition that's based on it has an impact, an observable impact on people's behaviors. So it's much more operant or functional definition of magic.
And it's certainly faster to communicate with. It's the thing that I worry about is the same thing I worry about when people talk about Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia didn't do shit. Russia's a concept that collectivizes a bunch of people. It's actually a few oligarchs with an army that physically went into Ukraine and invaded it. Now that's a lot more words to describe what's going on, but it prevents people from falsely placing agency on this concept Russia. And so just like you're talking about the eagle and the symbol, right? I don't want people to have this superstition of agency and I'm trying to dispel the magic system, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And when I talk about it as if it exists and as if it acts, I feel like I'm perpetuating the magic system.
Well, okay, I agree with you to a point, but my view here is that it's like telling the kid how the magician pulls the rabbit out of the hat. And if we really want to stop the magical system from having power, first people need to realize how and exactly which ways does this system affect the mind, and how do we give our power over by saying, it is just a symbol, it is just a piece of paper. Like you really think you have to go to the court? My background with 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗀, we didn't go into that a lot, it's like, you remember the Freeman movement? You've probably heard of this Freeman. So it was like claiming that you're a sovereign against the state. So I would have
the sovereign citizen.
Stories.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was like in that kind of vein of thinking. So getting a summons through the door, you say, I have to go to court because there's a gun at my head. But like, are there other things can you do? Can you learn to do your own magic? Can you learn to respond to these things in a certain way using certain words and certain powers? I won't go into all the detail, but a story happened recently. A friend of mine, he was offered a job. He accepted it. And then for some reason, they turned around and they said, sorry, we changed our mind. I think it was because they found out he was libertarian, and they found some of his beliefs and they didn't like it. I sent them one letter, and they sent $5,000 to his bank to say, we don't want this to be a problem. Please go away. So there's always choices there. There's many examples of people who have challenged the banks on their legitimacy to claim the debt. There's people who have challenged the government's authority, who turn around the claim and ask them to prove their claim against them, rather than just voluntarily turning up in court and saying, yeah, I'm this. I bet you it's all in all caps on your summons, right? It's all in all caps. That's not you. It's not you, the flesh and blood. It's this, like you said, Russia is this idea. Well, Patrick Smith written on this summons is a similar thing. And they need you to kind of there's still an aspect of voluntary nature here. By maybe it's from fear, maybe it's from, you know, your awareness that the system is cruel and punishing, and there could be consequences if you don't. But I think there's always options, and the more empowered we can become about how the system, the mechanics of the system, which the machine, then I think it at the very least gives us more options, or it can give us more options, or at the very, very least, it can give us a different sense of ourselves in how we interact with that. Are you interacting with it out of a state of fear, or out of a state of compulsion, or do you go in there with your head held high and, you know, speak your truth?
I had no idea there would be 3 entire shows wrapped up in our conversation. This is amazing. So I hope the viewers are enjoying long form content. This is the kind of content I've always wanted to do, these kind of conversations. So I did a video just to give you my perspective on what you're saying. I did an interview on my other channel, the philosophy channel, called 𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀, where I interviewed a guy that taught me what I call the jurisdiction gambit. And the title of the video, it's a way of challenging the court's jurisdiction in court cases, you know. And I called the video the best magic spell I've seen yet. And so
wow, I have to check that out.
Well, I mean, it was kind of a nerdy breakdown of how to use jurisdiction arguments in courts to challenge the jurisdiction, to reveal to the judge that they have no jurisdiction to actually charge you with anything. And it's a magic spell in a magic spell system. And the spells are only ever going to be as effective as the people will believe in them. And the judge believes in these magic spell systems. Otherwise, they're a hypocritic sycophant, you know, who knows he's a criminal and he's using the magic spells to trick people, and he knows that they're fake.
Which or for the most part, also is possible.
True. And or you know, best case, they believe in their own magic spell system, and you can cast spells back at them that can defend yourself. So that's what I kind of saw the jurisdiction gambit as being. And so I had a court case, and I haven't published this video yet. COVID thankfully forced a lot of the local courts to hold all of their courts on Zoom. And so I was able to use my entire studio rig to have a very good recording of the entire court interaction and me trying to use the jurisdiction gambit on this judge. And very quickly, he became just nasty with me, just very emotionally angry, and basically shut me down, forced me into a not guilty plea, into a trial by jury. And he set the date and he hung up on me. And so I now am back to that gun in the room thing. And that's kind of my counter argument here, is that at the end of the day, even if you're able to, not always, certainly sometimes the magic spells you cast back at them work and you get free, right? You trick them with their own system. But also at the end of the day, quite often, you meet the gun in the room. You meet the violence of the government. At the end of the day, system be damned, they're going to control you. And so that's what I try and wake people up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. And I've had a few dealings with the courts myself, especially when I was a bit younger and I was involved with 𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀. And there's a whole story there that would take too long to go into now. But I came to the realization, the same as you, that the things that you're saying, there's nothing wrong with them. Like when you go in and speak your truth in court, you stand as a free man on your own 2 feet and you try and reason for justice. I realized something, and this might sound a bit semantical, but I think it makes sense, is that the truth is we don't have a justice system, we have a legal system. And they're 2 very different things. And in an ideal world, we would have a justice system where if a judge treated you like that, there would be consequences. But it's always human beings, right? And they're going to protect themselves and so on. This is part of the reason why I went to study law, because I realized that there's a legal system. And they are absolutely bound by their own rules. It's just a question of us having the ability, the knowledge, on one hand, the willpower, which is can't be underestimated, because especially when you're one guy or, you know, going up against the system yourself, it's very hard to sustain the willpower. And then there's the financial challenges as well. Like, can you really afford to pursue a miscarriage of justice to the Supreme Courts and things like that? Usually that's not the case. So it's kind of set up in these layers where the little man isn't able to get justice because you're so far removed from the halls of power or from the places of justice where you can make constitutional arguments, and that's all that's taken into account. But it's a horrible reality. But I believe in truth. It's one of my fundamental values, and the truth. No one ever said it was going to be nice or going to be comfortable or going to give you a kiss goodnight, or when you're getting tucked into bed. The truth is often hard and painful and cold and brutal, and that's a brutal truth that you realize that the gun is always in the room. I believe that too, and that's part of like what motivates me to speak out for, to try somehow to advocate for a more just and more free society, because people like ourselves are very aware at how society really works, that there is an illusion there that at the end of the day, no matter how just you are, no matter how sound your arguments are philosophically, morally, ethically, they're going to use force against you. And the more people who kind of wake up to that reality and then feel this, which I'm sure you felt, this sickening feeling in your stomach, of revulsion to see these sycophants, as you call them, these men in costumes who lord it over the rest of us, when you know in your heart that there's so much more for humanity. We can be so much more than this. That for me, it compels me to commit my life to, promoting libertarian ideas or being in these circles, because anything less than this for me is kind of a sellout. I feel like it's a duty in a way, because I do see it as corrupt as it is.
I think that was a great way to end the show for today. I would like, where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, for the Brehon Academy stuff on YouTube, there's a lot of videos up there. I'm often uploading videos on Brehon Academy channel on YouTube. The main website is brehonacademy.org, where you can find online courses. I have 3 online courses that go into a lot of what we talked about in a little bit maybe of a more orderly way. Have articles and so on up there. I think that's probably the best. On Facebook as well, there's a brehonacademy.org Facebook page. And 𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗀 has been dormant for the last 7 or 8 years, but kind of as an addendum to what we were just talking about, I felt compelled after the pandemic and seeing how everything is to kind of revive that. So 𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗀 YouTube channel, that's TIRNASAOR, that's kind of going through a revamp now, and that will be a place where people will be able to find more information on the last part of our conversation, on the kind of magic spells and the state and the system, and how I kind of see that interplay, and how we can cultivate more sovereignty, how we can learn to be, and I don't profess to have the answers on this, I just want to have the conversation with people. Like, if we imagine a better world, what do those people act like? How do they speak? How do they think? So that's where I'll be having a conversation really about individual sovereignty and how to cultivate that, and how to cultivate our own power, and maybe connections with people through, I don't know, community, or just being of like mind. So the main place would be brehonacademy.org or 𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗀 YouTube channel.
Kevin Flanagan, I have enjoyed this conversation more than most that I've ever had in the 12 years that I've done YouTube. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. We have to do it again. I don't care what we talk about, but I look forward to it.
Well, Patrick, this was an absolute pleasure. I've given quite a few of these interviews as well about the Brehon Law, and this was one that I particularly enjoyed having. So I'm really grateful that you've given me the time and invited me onto your show, and I'd be more than happy to come onto your show another time and see where the conversation goes, because I think there's a lot more places we could explore.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kevin. Everybody out there, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy this kind of long form content. I know that this is where my heart is, And having these conversations, I think, will help change the world. Everybody, peace, love, and anarchy.